Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're getting into a conflict that, well, it often gets just a paragraph in the history books.
If that.
Right. But it fundamentally, redrew the map of Europe for the entire 18th century. We are talking about the War of the Spanish Succession.
A brutal 13-year struggle from 1701 to 1714.
And you really can't understand the rise of Great Britain as this global power or the final limits of French power under Louis XIV without getting this war.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just some European skirmish. I mean, this was a sprawling global conflict. It was running at the same time as the Great Northern War in the Baltic, Queen Anne's War in North America.
So this was what, the first truly modern great power conflict?
I'd say so. Fought over strategic and, maybe more importantly, economic control.
And the whole thing kicked off because of one simple yet totally catastrophic event.
The death of Charles II of Spain in November 1700. We call it the problem of the empty throne.
Okay, so Charles II, he's the last Habsburg king of Spain. And he was sickly, weak, and most critically,
he was childless. And while Spain itself, its military, its internal structure was really struggling, the empire itself was still vast.
And when you say vast, we're not just talking about Spain.
Oh, not at all. You're talking about the Spanish Netherlands, which is modern-day Belgium. You're talking about huge, wealthy territories in Italy, Milan, Naples, Sicily, Sardinia, and of course,
the Americas.
The gigantic, immensely rich American empire from Mexico down through Peru, plus the Philippines. It was a global inheritance.
So if that entire empire fell into the hands of either the French House of Bourbon or the Austrian House of Habsburg, the European balance of power, it just shatters.
Instantly. So our mission today is to unpack this long, difficult, and ultimately transformative war.
Right. We need to understand how Europe, especially Britain and the Dutch Republic, fought for over a decade to stop the union of the Spanish Empire with either France,
where Louis XIV's grandson, Philip of Anjou, was the candidate,
or Austria, with the Habsburg Archduke Charles as their guy. It was a war fought for balance, not really for conquest.
And the fascinating thing is, everyone saw this coming.
It wasn't a surprise at all.
No. The great powers had been anticipating the succession crisis and, frankly, scheming over how to carve up the spoils for decades.
Okay, so let's unpack that, the whole dynastic crisis, because it really shows just the utter failure of diplomacy before the war.
It does. Louis XIV of France and William III of England, they tried desperately to solve this peacefully.
By carving up the Spanish Empire themselves.
Before Charles II even died. And a key detail here, they completely excluded the Spanish government from the process.
So Spain had zero say in the fate of its own empire.
None. The first big attempt was the 1698 Treaty of The Hague, and the heir they landed on was Joseph Ferdinand of Bavaria, a 5-year-old child.
The idea of being a kid from Bavaria isn't a threat to anyone.
Exactly. France and Austria would get some bits and pieces on the side as compensation. It seemed like a neat solution.
But then history throws a curveball.
A very cruel one. Joseph Ferdinand dies just a year later in 1699. Smallpox.
So all those careful calculations, all the backroom deals, gone. Just like that.
Which forced them to try again. This is the 1700 Treaty of London, and this one was even more detailed and even more of a mess.
So who was the heir this time?
This time they designated the Austrian candidate, Archduke Charles. But, and this is a huge but, Louis XIV insisted on massive territorial compensation for France, especially in Italy.
What was he after in Italy?
He was eyeing Naples and Sicily. Major prizes that would give France huge leverage in the Mediterranean.
But the Austrians weren't having it.
No, neither Emperor Leopold nor Archduke Charles would agree to the split. They felt they were entitled to the whole Spanish inheritance, and any division was, frankly, an insult.
So the Treaty of London was basically pointless before the ink was even dry.
Completely pointless. Which brings us back to the dying king himself. With all the diplomacy in ruins, Charles II had to make the final call.
And his council in Madrid had some advice.
They convinced him that the only way to keep the empire in one piece was to give it to a power strong enough to defend it. And that power was France.
So Charles II's final will names Louis XIV's grandson, Philip, Duke of Anjou, as his sole heir.
With one absolute condition.
Philip had to renounce any claim to the French throne.
Exactly. So in November 1700, he's proclaimed Philip V of Spain. Louis XIV got what he wanted, seemingly without firing a shot. The crisis should have been over.
But it wasn't. This is where Louis's, I guess, staggering overconfidence just makes war inevitable.
He immediately put Bourbon power ahead of European peace. We can point to three specific fatal provocations that basically guaranteed a new Grand Alliance would form against him.
The first one being symbolic, but hugely important.
Louis registered Philip's claim to the French throne with the Parlement of Paris.
Which completely violates the will.
It completely violates the will. Even though Philip was only third in line, it terrified Europe. It explicitly raised the threat of the French and Spanish crowns uniting, creating a universal monarchy, the very thing everyone was trying to prevent.
Provocation number 2 was military.
Yes, aimed right at Austria. French troops quickly moved in and occupied the Spanish-controlled Duchy of Milan and allied Mantua in northern Italy. This basically forced Emperor Leopold's hand. He had to fight for Italy now, no matter what.
And the third one hit the maritime powers, Britain and the Dutch, where it hurt, their commercial and strategic interests.
In the Low Countries, this is the issue of the barrier fortresses.
Right. After the last war, the Dutch had the right to put their own soldiers in key forts in the Spanish Netherlands to protect their border.
And Louis just sent in French troops to kick them out. He replaced the Dutch garrisons.
It's a massive insult, diplomatically and militarily.
It's huge. It removes the buffer zone protecting the Dutch Republic. And even worse, now France controls that whole coastline, including ports like Antwerp and Ostend. That threatens the Dutch trade monopoly on the Scheldt River.
And gives France a perfect launch pad for an invasion of England.
Precisely. So you have this triple threat: a dynastic threat, a military threat to Austria, and a strategic and commercial threat to the maritime powers. War was now a certainty.
So the response is the Treaty of The Hague in September 1701. The old Grand Alliance is back.
Leopold, the Dutch Republic, and Britain? But even then, they weren't explicitly demanding Archduke Charles be king. Not yet.
But then Louis makes one final mistake.
The final trigger, at least for Britain: the exiled Catholic king, James II of England, dies in France. And Louis reneges on his earlier promise to recognize William III and publicly declares Jones's son the rightful king of England.
You just don't touch the Protestant succession in Britain. That is the absolute red line.
And that was it. William died soon after, but his successor, Queen Anne, was fully committed. The Dutch declared war in May 1702. Britain and the Emperor followed a week later. The conflict was on.
So now that we have the trigger events, we need to talk about the deeper strategic drivers. I mean, why were Britain and the Dutch willing to basically bankrupt themselves over who sat on a throne in Madrid?
The simple answer is economics. This was the age of mercantilism, and for the statesmen of the time, the global economy was a zero-sum game.
So not a growing pie, but a fixed pie. And to get a bigger slice, you had to take it from someone else.
Exactly. State power was directly linked to accumulating gold and silver. And to do that, you had to maximize exports, minimize imports, and just ruthlessly attack the commerce of your rival.
We see that in the tariffs, right? You mentioned that English import duties on foreign goods went up by 400%.
An incredible number. And France banned English manufactured goods outright. So for the English and the Dutch, yeah, securing their borders was one goal. But the dominant economic goal was getting access to those huge Spanish markets in the Americas.
And keeping the French out.
And keeping the French out. That's why the conflict immediately goes global. The real prize wasn't Europe. It was the right to trade with Spain's American colonies.
Okay, let's look at the money, the finances of the powers, because you say this is where Britain had a sort of secret weapon.
It really was. France was, on paper, the most powerful state. Biggest population, strongest economy. But past wars had left it financially drained. Its tax system was a mess, inefficient.
And Britain's secret weapon wasn't more wealth, it was better financial tools.
It was financial innovation. The war cost an unprecedented amount of money, but Britain had already pioneered modern public debt. The creation of the Bank of England in 1694, the institutionalizing of a national debt. It all meant the government could borrow huge sums of money reliably and at lower interest rates than its enemies.
They were fighting the war on credit, essentially.
On future revenue, guaranteed by a stable financial system. While the French and Spanish systems were struggling with corruption and couldn't be trusted to pay people back, the British government could consistently raise the money to pay its allies and fund Marlborough's massive armies.
This financial strength was probably the single greatest long-term advantage the alliance had.
It really was.
Now let's turn to Spain itself, the prize of the war. You mentioned this paradox earlier. Bullion is pouring in from the Americas, but the state is bankrupt. Where was the money going?
It was a structural problem. That silver was basically spoken for before it even landed. It went straight to foreign bankers who'd financed Spain's previous wars, or it was absorbed by this huge, inefficient bureaucracy. There was almost no investment in the military or infrastructure.
So by 1701, Spain had, what, fewer than 15,000 troops?
It's a tiny navy. It was basically a hollow shell, an asset waiting for a more competent power to manage it.
Which brings us to the internal divide in Spain, which is crucial for how the war played out there.
Yes. You have to remember, Spain wasn't a unified country in the modern sense. It was a personal union between two crowns, the Crown of Castile and the Crown of Aragon.
And they had very different ideas about how Spain should be governed.
Totally different. The Castilian elite in Madrid, they saw centralized power, Bourbon-style reforms as the only way to save Spain, so they overwhelmingly backed Philip V.
But the Crown of Aragon, that's Catalonia, Valencia, and so on, they had their ancient privileges, the fueros.
These guaranteed them regional autonomy, their own courts, their own taxes. They were terrified that the French Bourbons, with their tradition of absolutism, would just erase all of that.
So for them, the Habsburg Archduke Charles was the better bet.
Much better. So when he landed, the Crown of Aragon became his strongest base of support. The war in Spain was as much a civil war between these two political cultures as it was an international conflict.
Let's move to the battlefield. The scale of this is just staggering. Armies in the Low Countries with over 120,000 men. I mean, how did pre-industrial economies even support that?
With immense difficulty. Logistics dictated everything. Campaigns followed the rivers, the Rhine, the Danube, because you simply couldn't move food and supplies for that many men and horses over land.
So the Bourbon armies had an advantage, being closer to home.
They had internal lines, yes, but the Allies could use their naval supremacy to supply their forces along the coasts and up those big rivers.
The war really kicks off in Italy, but the decisive shift comes in Germany. By 1704, the French and their Bavarian allies are planning a knockout blow.
A march down the Danube to capture Vienna and force Austria out of the war. It would have collapsed the Grand Alliance.
And to stop this, the Duke of Marlborough undertakes this legendary march.
It's a masterpiece of strategy and logistics. He pretends he's going to attack in one place, gets the funds from the Dutch, and then, without telling anyone his real destination, he marches his army 250 miles across Germany in 5 weeks.
An incredible feat for the time.
And it completely wrong-footed the French. He links up with Prince Eugene of Savoy, and their combined army meets the Franco-Bavarian force at a little village called Blenheim.
And Blenheim wasn't just a victory, it was an annihilation.
Total. The Franco-Bavarian army lost over 30,000 men. It shattered Louis XIV's ambitions in Germany, it saved Vienna, and it forced Bavaria completely out of the war. The French were driven back across the Rhine and never seriously threatened Germany again.
And the momentum just keeps going. 1706, the Battle of Ramillies.
Another huge defeat for the French. After that, the Allies basically occupied the entire Spanish Netherlands in a couple of weeks. From that point on, France is on the defensive.
Meanwhile, what's happening in the south? In Italy?
Well, for Austria, Italy was always the main prize, even more so than Spain. The key moment there is when Savoy switches sides in 1703.
Why was that so important?
Because it opened up a new front against the French. In 1706, Prince Eugene wins a stunning victory at the Siege of Turin, and that basically ends French power in Italy. By 1707, it's pretty much all over there. The Habsburgs get Milan, Naples, and Sardinia.
And with the Mediterranean now secure, the British can focus on Spain itself and protecting their trade routes.
Yes, and they focus on strategic ports, not trying to conquer the whole country. The most famous example, of course, is the capture of Gibraltar in 1704.
Why was Gibraltar such a non-negotiable prize for Britain?
It gave the Royal Navy a permanent base right at the entrance to the Mediterranean. It's a perfect spot to refuel, repair, and project power. That was reinforced by the capture of Minorca in 1708, which had an even better deep-water harbor. These ports became absolute must-haves for the British.
But on the Spanish mainland itself, the war was just a frustrating slog for the Allies.
A total slog. Archduke Charles actually got into Madrid twice.
But he couldn't hold it.
He couldn't hold it. The Castilian population saw him as a foreign invader and stayed loyal to Philip V. The Allies just couldn't sustain their armies deep inside Spain, away from their naval supply lines.
So you could win the battles, but you couldn't win the peace.
Exactly. And the final nail in the coffin for Allied hopes in Spain was the Bourbon victory at Villaviciosa in late 1710. That battle confirmed Philip's control over the heartland of Spain for good.
So by 1708, the Grand Alliance has pretty much met all its original goals. France is contained, the Dutch border is secure, Britain controls the Med.
But that success made them overconfident. It led to what you could call mission creep.
And that overconfidence was fatal to making peace. By 1709, France is in a catastrophic position. Famine from the Great Frost, the financial system is collapsing. Louis XIV is desperate for peace.
So he opens negotiations. He's willing to give up almost everything.
But the Allies make one demand that is just so humiliating, so insulting, that Louis has to refuse.
They demand that Louis XIV must personally use the French army to remove his own grandson from the Spanish throne by force if Philip refuses to leave.
Wait, they're demanding he go to war with his own family?
Yes. And hand over key French fortresses as collateral first. Louis famously said that if he must fight, he'd rather fight his enemies than his own children.
So the arrogance of the Allies backfired.
Spectacularly. It allowed Louis to rally the French people who are now fighting not for conquest, but to defend France itself from destruction.
And at the same time, the Allies are feeling the strain. The Dutch are nearing bankruptcy.
And then history deals the ultimate wild card, an event that has nothing to do with the military but changes everything.
In April 1711, Emperor Joseph I dies of smallpox.
And his brother and heir is...
Archduke Charles, the Allied candidate for the Spanish throne.
That's right. So Archduke Charles is now Holy Roman Emperor. If the Allies succeed in making him King of Spain too, they would recreate the massive Habsburg Empire of Charles V from the 16th century.
The very thing the war started to prevent. A universal monarchy.
Exactly. The entire strategic reason for the war just evaporated overnight for Britain and the Dutch. A Habsburg union was now just as dangerous as a Bourbon one. Peace became an immediate necessity.
And this happens to coincide with a change in government in Britain. The pro-peace Tories win the 1710 election.
The timing was perfect. The new British government starts secret negotiations with France, completely cutting out their allies.
So what were Britain's key demands in this separate peace?
They were very concrete. First, French acceptance of the separate crowns of France and Spain and the Protestant succession in Britain. Second, the permanent handover of Gibraltar and Minorca.
And third,
and this is probably the most significant game for the British Empire long term, a 30-year monopoly on the Asiento de Negros.
let's pause on that, the Asiento.
Yeah.
Because this wasn't just some minor trade deal.
Oh, not at all. This was a fundamentally transformative commercial prize. And we have to be very clear, it was based on the horrific transatlantic slave trade.
It was the right to import enslaved Africans into the Spanish-American colonies.
A right formerly held by the French. Britain secured this exclusive 30-year monopoly, and the wealth it generated was immense. It led to the creation of the South Sea Company in Britain.
So this government-backed monopoly on human trafficking poured huge amounts of capital into the British economy.
It's a dark and undeniable foundation for the wealth that solidified Britain's commercial dominance for the next century.
While Britain is making its peace, the Austro-Dutch forces try to fight on.
But without British money and troops, it's hopeless. The French win a decisive victory at the Battle of Denain in 1712, and that convinces the Dutch it's over.
Which leads to the final peace treaty, the Peace of Utrecht in 1713. Philip V is confirmed as King of Spain, but on that one crucial condition.
He and his heirs must formally renounce any and all claim to the throne of France forever.
So the Peace of Utrecht is the mold that defines the new European order. It's remembered not just for the new borders, but for the core principle it established.
Now, that principle is right there in the treaty. It says that the same person should never become king of both kingdoms because of the great danger which threatened the liberty and safety of all Europe.
So it's the point where dynastic claims are officially made secondary to the balance of power.
Some historians see it as a key moment in the development of the idea of collective security and the modern nation-state.
Okay, so let's look at the final scoreboard. Who were the winners and losers?
Great Britain is the unambiguous winner. They get security, they get strategic naval bases in the Med, and through the Asiento, they seize commercial supremacy from the Dutch. And their financial system means they can actually manage the massive debt from the war.
What about France? Financially exhausted?
Exhausted, yes. But Louis XIV did achieve his main goal. A Bourbon is on the throne of Spain, and the Habsburg encirclement is broken, but the debt would cripple France for decades.
Austria fails to get Spain, but they get a lot of compensation closer to home.
They get the Spanish Netherlands, which become the Austrian Netherlands, and they establish dominance in Italy with Milan and Naples. They pivot to becoming a Central European power.
And the Dutch Republic, they get their border fortresses, which was their main goal.
They do, but the war leaves them bankrupt. They survived, but Britain permanently replaced them as the world's leading commercial and maritime power. They were eclipsed.
And finally, what about Spain itself? What was the legacy of Philip V's victory?
It was a legacy of centralization. Philip rewarded Castile for its loyalty and punished Aragon for its disloyalty. He issued the Nueva Planta decrees.
And these decrees just abolished all those old regional privileges, the fueros.
Wiped them out. He dismantled the old decentralized Habsburg system and created a truly centralized administration run from Madrid.
So even though Spain lost its European territories, internally, it actually became a stronger, more coherent kingdom.
Much more so. And it kept its massive American empire. It survived, independent, just now allied with France.
So this deep dive really shows that the War of the Spanish Succession was so much more than a family squabble over a crown. It was the moment the boundaries of European power were set, prioritizing national and commercial interest over who was related to whom.
And in doing that, it created the perfect conditions for British naval and commercial supremacy, a supremacy that would define global geopolitics for the entire 18th century. It created an economic gap that France just could not close.
And that commercial supremacy, as we've talked about, was cemented by the Asiento de Negros, the right to traffic enslaved people across the Atlantic.
It's a powerful and very sobering final takeaway. The stability of the European balance of power, the security of Britain, the whole modern state framework that comes out of Utrecht.
It rests on a foundation built with this horrific commercial engine.
It certainly raises an important question for you to reflect on. When we study these grand strategic victories, the balance of power, how often do we fail to account for the hidden immoral costs, like the Asiento, that truly financed and forged the world that came next? Something to consider as you think about this massive formative conflict.